The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I pushed through the double doors of St. Bartholomew General Hospital. It was 3 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday, and the corridors stretched before me like the arteries of some massive sleeping beast. My footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum floors, each sound bouncing off walls that had witnessed decades of human suffering and fleeting moments of joy. I was not supposed to be here. None of us were. My name is David Chen, and until 6 months ago, I had been a security guard at this very hospital. 12 years of night shifts, walking these same hallways, checking locked doors, ensuring that the darkness held no unwelcome visitors. 12 years of thinking I knew every corner of this place, every shadow that belonged, and every sound that meant nothing more than the building settling into its nightly rhythm. I had been wrong about everything. The invitation had come through channels I still did not fully understand. A message left in my locker at the security company where I now work downtown, written on hospital stationery that should not have existed. The letterhead bore the seal of St. Bartholomew General, but the paper felt different somehow, heavier, as if it carried weight beyond its physical substance. The words were simple enough. You are invited to participate in the hunting. Midnight. Ward 7. Come alone. Ward 7 had been closed for renovations 3 years ago. I remembered the day they moved the last patients out, their belongings loaded onto gurneys and wheeled through corridors that would soon fall silent. The administration had cited structural concerns, outdated electrical systems, the need for modernization that never seemed to come. But I had walked those empty halls during my final months at the hospital, and there had been nothing wrong with the bones of the place. The walls were solid, the floors level, the rooms clean and ready for occupation. Something else had driven the decision to seal that ward away from the rest of the hospital. Standing now in the main lobby, I could see the barriers that blocked access to the 7th floor. Yellow tape and official notices warning of construction hazards that did not exist. Security cameras that had been disabled months ago but never removed, their dark lenses staring blindly at nothing. The elevators had been programmed to skip the 7th floor entirely, as if that level of the building had been erased from existence. But I knew the ways around such obstacles. 12 years of night security had taught me the hidden paths through any building, the maintenance corridors and service elevators that bypassed official restrictions. The freight elevator at the north end of the building still responded to the override codes I had memorized, still carried authorized personnel to floors that officially did not exist. As I rode the elevator upward through floors of sleeping patients and busy night staff, I wondered about the others who had received similar invitations. The message had been clear that I would not be alone in whatever awaited on Ward 7. Others had been chosen, others had been summoned to participate in something that defied easy explanation. But chosen for what? And by whom? The elevator shuddered to a stop at the 7th floor, its doors opening onto darkness that seemed to press against the light from the car's interior. I stepped out into a corridor that should have been familiar but felt alien somehow, transformed by absence into something that belonged to a different building entirely. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing walls that were clean and undamaged, floors that showed no sign of the construction work that supposedly justified the ward's closure. The silence was complete in a way that hospitals never achieved. No hum of ventilation systems, no distant sounds of medical equipment, no muffled conversations from nursing stations. Even the ever-present background noise of a functioning hospital had been eliminated here, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the soft whisper of my shoes against the floor. Room numbers passed in my flashlight beam as I made my way deeper into the ward. 701, 703, 705, each door standing open to reveal empty chambers that had once housed the sick and dying. The beds had been removed along with most of the medical equipment, but the mounting brackets remained on the walls like surgical scars. 4 stands stood forgotten in corners, their metal arms reaching toward absent patients. It was in room 717 that I encountered the first sign that others had answered the invitation. A backpack sat on the windowsill, modern and expensive, containing items that suggested careful preparation for whatever the night might bring. A digital camera with night vision capabilities, A voice recorder, a notebook filled with handwriting I did not recognize, medical supplies that seemed oddly specific in their selection, bandages designed for deep lacerations, antiseptic strong enough to clean surgical instruments, pain medication that required prescriptions I doubted the owner possessed. The window in room 717 looked out over the hospital's rear parking lot, where a handful of cars sat beneath flickering streetlights. More vehicles than should have been present at this hour, their owners presumably somewhere in the building, drawn by the same mysterious summons that had brought me here. I counted 6 cars, which meant at least 5 other individuals had responded to invitations similar to my own. Moving deeper into the ward, I began to notice details that had been invisible during my previous security rounds. Scratch marks on door frames that looked deliberate rather than accidental. Stains on the walls that had been painted over but remained visible under the harsh LED light of my flashlight. Numbers written in pencil beside room numbers. A secondary numbering system that followed no logic I could discern. The nurses' station at the centre of the ward had been stripped of its computers and communication equipment, but the basic structure remained intact. Charts still hung from clips on the walls, though their pages were blank now. The medication storage unit stood open and empty, its multiple locks disabled and doors swinging freely. Behind the main desk, a bulletin board displayed notices that had never been removed, shift schedules from 3 years ago still pinned in place like artifacts from a vanished civilization. It was here, studying those forgotten schedules, that I heard the first sound that did not belong to my own movement through the empty ward. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose through corridors parallel to my own position. The hunting had begun, though I still did not understand what prey we sought or what rules governed this strange nocturnal gathering. The footsteps were approaching from 2 directions, converging on the nurse's station where I stood. I could hear voices now, low conversations that carried meanings I could not quite make out. Professional discussions conducted in medical terminology, mixed with phrases that belonged to no healing art I recognized. References to procedures that had no place in legitimate medicine. Mentions of subjects and specimens, and success rates that sent cold fingers walking up my spine. They were close now, close enough that I could distinguish individual voices. A woman speaking with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to giving orders that were obeyed without question. A man whose tone suggested familiarity with violence as a tool rather than an unfortunate necessity. Others whose words remained indistinct, but whose presence filled the darkened ward with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand upright. I realized then that I had made a fundamental error in coming here. The invitation had not been extended to me as a former security guard with knowledge of the building's layout. I had not been chosen for my experience or my discretion or any positive quality I might possess. I had been selected for reasons that had nothing to do with participation and everything to do with necessity. The hunting at St. Bartholomew General Hospital was about to begin, and I was beginning to understand that I might not be one of the hunters. The voices drew closer, and I pressed myself against the wall beside the medication storage unit, my flashlight extinguished. The darkness that had seemed oppressive moments before now offered the only protection available. Through the gaps in the counter structure, I could see the faint glow of approaching lights, multiple beams that moved with coordination that spoke of rehearsed procedures rather than casual exploration. "Subject 7 should be in position by now," came the woman's voice, clearer now that the speakers had entered the central area of the ward. Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex operations where failure carried consequences beyond mere disappointment. "Monitoring equipment confirms presence in the target zone. Subject 7. The designation hit me with the force of sudden understanding. I wasn't here as a participant in whatever ceremony these people conducted in the abandoned ward. I was the focus of their attention, the reason for their gathering, the prey they had assembled to hunt through corridors I had once patrolled as a guardian rather than a victim. A man's voice responded with the casual professionalism of someone discussing routine maintenance rather than human pursuit. "Perimeter is secure. Exit routes have been sealed according to protocol. Emergency communications are disabled throughout the ward. We have approximately 4 hours before shift change brings unwanted attention to this level. 4 hours. The number settled into my consciousness like a death sentence. 4 hours during which I would be trapped on this floor with individuals whose purposes remained unclear but whose methods suggested outcomes I preferred not to contemplate. The careful preparation evident in their coordination spoke of experience with similar situations, of other nights when other subjects had found themselves in positions similar to my own. Psychological profile suggests flight rather than confrontation, continued the woman, her words accompanied by the soft rustle of papers being consulted. 12 years of security experience, but no military background. No combat training beyond basic certification requirements. Physical condition adequate but unremarkable. Stress response patterns indicate preference for evasion over engagement. They knew me. Not just my name or my employment history, but details that should have been private, characteristics that required observation and analysis to determine. Someone had been studying me for longer than the 6 months since I had left St. Bartholomew General. Someone had been building a profile that would inform the tactics they employed in whatever game they intended to play with my life as the stakes. The beams of their flashlights swept through the nurses' station, probing corners and checking spaces where a hiding person might attempt to conceal themselves. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing, relying on skills learned during childhood games of hide and seek, rather than any formal training in evasion or survival. The irony was not lost on me that the same corridors where I had once searched for intruders now sheltered me from hunters who moved with far greater skill and determination than any trespasser I had ever encountered. Motion sensors indicate recent activity in rooms 715 through 720, reported another voice, this one younger, tinged with an excitement that suggested personal investment in the evening's proceedings beyond mere professional obligation. Heat signature analysis confirms our subject investigated the planted materials in 717. Behavioral patterns match predicted responses to environmental stimuli. Planted materials. The backpack I had discovered had been deliberately placed to draw my attention, to establish my location and confirm my presence in the ward. Every step I had taken since exiting the elevator had been anticipated, factored into calculations that reduced my actions to predictable responses to carefully arranged circumstances. I was not simply being hunted, I was being studied, observed as a specimen whose behavior provided data for purposes that remained hidden in the darkness beyond my understanding. The lights moved away from the nurses' station, spreading out through the ward in patterns that suggested systematic coverage rather than random searching. These people understood the layout of Ward 7 as well as I did, possibly better. They moved with the confidence of individuals operating in familiar territory, their coordination speaking of previous rehearsals in these same corridors. I waited until their lights had moved sufficiently distant before risking movement of my own. The maintenance closet behind the nurses' station offered temporary refuge, its interior cramped but concealed from casual observation. Among the cleaning supplies and forgotten equipment, I found items that spoke to the ward's true history. Medical charts that had never been transferred with the relocated patients. Medication logs that showed discrepancies between ordered and administered doses. Incident reports that documented events requiring explanations that had never been provided. Ward 7 had not been closed for renovations. It had been sealed because of activities that required concealment, procedures that could not be conducted under the scrutiny that normal hospital operations would bring. The documents I discovered in that cramped closet painted a picture of experiments disguised as treatment, of patients who had become subjects without their knowledge or consent, of outcomes that justified the permanent closure of an entire floor rather than risk exposure of what had transpired here. Dr. Margaret Holloway's signature appeared on most of the documentation, authorizing treatments that bore no resemblance to accepted medical practice. Patient consent forms that had been forged or coerced, authorization for procedures that existed in no medical textbook, research protocols that violated every ethical standard established since the Nuremberg trials. The woman whose voice now coordinated my pursuit through these darkened halls had once used this same space for activities that transformed healing into something altogether more sinister. Subject 7 has gone to ground in the central section, came her voice from somewhere deeper in the ward. Thermal imaging suggests concealment rather than continued movement. This matches predicted behavior patterns for cornered prey. Transitioning to flush protocols. Flush protocols. The clinical terminology failed to disguise the predatory nature of what they intended. I was no longer being hunted through the ward, I was being driven toward a predetermined location where whatever they planned to do could be accomplished with greater efficiency. The systematic nature of their operations suggested experience with resistant subjects, knowledge of how frightened people behaved when trapped in unfamiliar territory with limited options for escape. The maintenance closet that had seemed like refuge moments before now felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. I needed movement, needed to break the patterns they expected, needed to transform myself from prey into something more difficult to predict and capture. The documents I had discovered provided more than historical context. They offered tactical information about the layout of Ward 7 that even my 12 years of security rounds had not revealed. Hidden passages connected some of the rooms, service corridors that allowed medical staff to move between patient areas without using the main hallways. These passages had been designed to facilitate discreet observation of subjects during Dr. Holloway's unauthorized experiments, but they could serve my purposes now if I could locate the concealed entrances described in the architectural modifications documented in her research files. Room 724 was listed as the primary observation point, connected to rooms 722, 726, and 728 through passages that would be invisible to casual inspection. If the documentation was accurate, I could move between these areas without exposing myself to the systematic search being conducted in the main corridors. The risk was significant. The passages might no longer be accessible, might have been sealed when the ward was closed, might lead to dead ends that would leave me more trapped than my current position. But remaining in the maintenance closet guaranteed capture. The thermal imaging they mentioned would eventually pinpoint my location regardless of how well I concealed myself from visual detection. Movement offered the only possibility of avoiding whatever fate they had planned for Subject 7, whatever conclusion they intended for their hunting expedition in the abandoned ward of St. Bartholomew General Hospital. I gathered the most relevant documents from the closet, evidence that might prove useful if I survived to share what I had discovered, then began my careful movement toward room 724. Behind me, the sounds of systematic searching continued, growing more organized, more focused, more inevitable with each passing moment. The hunting was far from over, but perhaps the hunters were about to discover that their carefully planned evening might not proceed according to their expectations. The passage to room 724 required traversing 20 meters of open corridor where the hunters' lights could expose me at any moment. I waited in the doorway of the maintenance closet, counting the seconds between their coordinated sweeps, identifying the gaps in their coverage that might allow movement without detection. Their patterns were professional, but not perfect. Brief windows existed where shadows provided concealment for someone willing to move with absolute precision. The first 10 meters passed without incident, my soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. I pressed myself against the wall between rooms 718 and 720, listening to their communications as they methodically cleared each patient room. Their terminology remained clinical, discussing angles of approach and containment strategies as if I were a specimen that had escaped from a laboratory, rather than a human being fighting for survival in corridors I had once protected. "Heat signature has shifted toward the eastern section," reported the younger voice, excitement evident despite attempts at professional restraint. "Predicted movement patterns suggest Subject 7 is attempting to reach the stairwell access point. Recommend repositioning Team Beta to intercept." Team Beta. The casual reference revealed the scope of their operation extended beyond the voices I had identified. More hunters moved through Ward 7 than I had initially realized, their positions coordinated through communication systems that allowed real-time tactical adjustments. Whatever organization had arranged this nocturnal gathering possessed resources that suggested institutional backing rather than amateur enthusiasm. I reached room 724 as their lights began sweeping toward my position, slipping inside just as illumination washed across the corridor where I had been standing moments before. The room appeared identical to the others I had seen, stripped of medical equipment but retaining the basic infrastructure of a patient care facility. But according to the documents I carried, this space had served purposes that extended far beyond conventional treatment. The hidden passage entrance should have been located behind the bathroom door, disguised as routine plumbing access, but actually providing entry to the observation network Dr. Holloway had constructed throughout this section of the ward. My flashlight beam revealed what appeared to be standard utility connections, pipes and electrical conduits that belonged in any hospital room. But the mounting brackets were positioned incorrectly, angled to accommodate passage rather than function. The access panel required pressure applied to specific points simultaneously, a security measure that prevented accidental discovery by maintenance staff or curious patients. When the mechanism finally responded, the panel swung inward to reveal a narrow corridor that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of my light. The air that emerged from the passage carried scents of disuse and something else, something organic that had been sealed away from circulation for too long. I squeezed through the opening into a space barely wide enough for a single person, designed for movement rather than comfort. The walls were lined with observation equipment that had been abandoned when the ward closed, cameras and recording devices that had once monitored subjects without their knowledge. Some of the screens still flickered with residual power, displaying static patterns that suggested the surveillance network remained partially functional, even after years of neglect. The passage branched after 15 feet, offering routes toward rooms 722 and 726, according to the architectural plans I had memorized. Both directions led deeper into the maze of hidden corridors that honeycombed this section of Ward 7, spaces that existed between the official floor plan and the reality of what Dr. Holloway had constructed for her unauthorized research. The decision of which path to take would determine whether I moved closer to potential escape routes or deeper into areas where discovery would mean certain capture. Behind me, muffled by the walls of room 724, I could hear the hunters entering the space I had just vacated. Their systematic search would eventually reveal the hidden entrance despite Dr. Holloway's security measures. Professional training would recognize the anomalous construction details that marked concealed passages, would identify the architectural modifications that served no legitimate medical purpose. Subject 7's thermal signature has disappeared from sensor range, came Dr. Holloway's voice closer now, speaking from what sounded like the corridor directly outside room 724. This suggests either electronic countermeasures we did not anticipate or access to areas not covered by our monitoring network. Initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 carried implications that chilled me more than the confined space or the growing certainty of discovery. Their planning had included contingencies for situations exactly like this, procedures designed to handle subjects who exceeded the behavioral parameters their psychological profiles had predicted. Whatever Protocol 7 entailed, it represented an escalation that would make my current predicament seem manageable by comparison. The passage toward room 726 offered the most direct route toward the ward's eastern boundary, where emergency stairwells might provide escape from the 7th floor entirely. But the hunters had already demonstrated awareness of such obvious possibilities, had positioned Team Beta to intercept movement toward stairwell access points. The route toward room 722 led deeper into the ward's interior, toward areas that might offer concealment but would also distance me from any viable exit strategy. I chose depth over distance, reasoning that survival required avoiding capture long enough to understand the full scope of their operation, rather than attempting immediate escape through routes they had already anticipated. The passage toward room 722 descended slightly as it progressed, following the building's original construction lines while accommodating the surveillance equipment Dr. Holloway had installed throughout the hidden network. The observation stations I passed revealed the true extent of her unauthorized research program. Multiple rooms had been modified for simultaneous monitoring, allowing comprehensive data collection from subjects who believed they were receiving routine medical treatment. Video recordings remained stored on obsolete equipment, digital archives of procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. The timestamps on the recordings indicated activity had continued for months after the official closure of Ward 7, suggesting Dr. Holloway had maintained access long after the administration believed the area had been sealed. Room 722 appeared through a concealed entrance behind what had once been the head wall of a patient bed. The space beyond was larger than the others I had seen, configured as a surgical suite rather than a standard patient room. Equipment that should have been removed during the ward's closure remained in place, covered by sheets but still connected to power sources that indicated recent use. This was not abandoned infrastructure left behind by hasty evacuation. This was an active facility disguised as decommissioned space. The surgical table in the centre of the room bore restraints that had been designed for subjects who would not cooperate voluntarily. Leather straps reinforced with metal cables, positioned to immobilise arms, legs, torso and head with mechanical precision. Monitoring equipment surrounded the table, devices that measured vital signs alongside others whose functions remained unclear, but whose purpose seemed focused on recording rather than treatment. I recognized some of the apparatus from medical dramas and documentaries, standard surgical instruments and anesthesia equipment that belonged in any operating room. But other devices defied easy identification, electronic systems that seemed designed to interface with the human nervous system in ways that had no legitimate medical application. The combination suggested procedures that blended surgery with something that resembled interrogation more than healing. A filing cabinet against the far wall contained records that documented the true nature of Dr. Holloway's research program, patient files that showed systematic progression from routine treatment to increasingly invasive procedures, justified by medical conditions that had been artificially induced rather than naturally occurring. Consent forms that had been signed by individuals whose mental capacity had been compromised by medications administered without their knowledge. Research data that tracked the effectiveness of various techniques for extracting information from unwilling subjects. The patients who had been moved from Ward 7 3 years ago had not been relocated to other facilities within the hospital system. They had been transferred to locations that existed outside normal medical oversight, places where Dr. Holloway's research could continue without the constraints imposed by institutional review boards or professional ethics committees. The ward's closure had been cover for the expansion of her program rather than its termination. Thermal sweep indicates Subject 7 has accessed the observation network, came the younger voice through the walls, excitement now mixed with frustration at the complexity their quarry was introducing to their carefully planned evening. Infrastructure analysis suggests multiple possible positions throughout the modified sections of the ward. Recommend implementing full containment protocols. Full containment protocols implied sealing the hidden passage network to prevent further movement, trapping me within the maze of corridors and observation chambers Dr. Holloway had constructed. The hunters possessed detailed knowledge of the modifications she had made to Ward 7, information that allowed them to predict my possible routes and implement countermeasures that would eliminate my options one by one. The surgical suite offered no exit other than the concealed entrance through which I had entered, making it a potential trap despite the valuable intelligence its files contained. But the documents revealed information that transformed my understanding of the evening's events from random predation to something far more systematic and terrifying. This was not an isolated incident of hunting for entertainment or psychological satisfaction. This was data collection for research that continued Dr. Holloway's work using methodologies that had been refined through years of practice. I was not Subject 7 because I happened to be the 7th person selected for their hunting games. I was Subject 7 because 6 others had preceded me through these same corridors, had faced these same hunters, had provided the behavioural data that allowed such precise prediction of my responses to their stimuli. The backpack in room 717, the thermal imaging, the coordinated search patterns, all of it represented the application of knowledge gained through previous iterations of this same scenario. The other subjects had not escaped. Their fates were documented in files that tracked physiological and psychological responses to various stressors, data that informed the current operations tactics and expected outcomes. I was participating in research that had been designed to conclude with my capture and subsequent involvement in procedures that bore no resemblance to legitimate medical treatment. The sound of mechanical systems activating throughout the ward indicated the implementation of their full containment protocols. Ventilation ceased, emergency lighting flickered and died, electronic locks engaged on doors that had been left open to suggest possible escape routes. The hidden passage network was being sealed systematically. cutting off access to areas they could not monitor while funneling me toward locations where capture would be inevitable. But the files in the surgical suite had revealed something their protocols had not anticipated. Dr. Holloway's modifications to Ward 7 included emergency procedures designed to protect her research from discovery by hospital administration or regulatory authorities, hidden systems that could be activated to destroy evidence, eliminate traces of unauthorized activities, create plausible explanations for any anomalies that might attract unwanted attention. The activation codes were documented in her personal files, sequences that would trigger systems designed to simulate catastrophic equipment failures throughout the ward. Fire suppression systems that would flood the area with inert gases, electrical failures that would disable all monitoring equipment, emergency broadcasts that would summon legitimate hospital security to investigate what appeared to be a serious infrastructure failure on the supposedly empty 7th floor. These systems had been Dr. Holloway's insurance against exposure, her means of eliminating evidence if her research faced official scrutiny. But they could serve my purposes now, creating confusion that might allow escape from hunters who depended on technological advantages to maintain their tactical superiority. The risk was enormous. The emergency systems had been designed to protect equipment and documents rather than human life. But remaining trapped in the observation network guaranteed outcomes that made any risk preferable to certain capture. The control panel was concealed behind a false wall panel near the surgical table, accessible through biometric scanners that had been programmed to recognize Dr. Holloway's genetic markers. But the system included manual overrides designed for situations where normal authentication might be compromised, emergency procedures that could be activated through knowledge of the proper sequences rather than biological verification. As I worked to access the control systems, the sounds of approaching footsteps echoed through the passage network surrounding room 722. The hunters had identified my location within the observation maze and were moving to implement final capture protocols. Their coordination remained professional despite the complications I had introduced, their movement suggesting confidence that whatever emergency measures I might attempt would prove inadequate against their preparation and resources. They were about to discover that Dr. Holloway's paranoid security measures had created possibilities their intelligence gathering had not anticipated, that the very systems designed to protect her research could be turned against those who now used her methods for their own purposes. The hunting at St. Bartholomew General Hospital was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test whether predators remained effective when their carefully controlled environment suddenly became as dangerous to them as it was to their intended prey. The activation sequence initiated with a low hum that vibrated through the walls and floor of the surgical suite, the first indication that systems dormant for 3 years were responding to commands they had been programmed to obey without question. The emergency systems erupted throughout Ward 7 with the violence of machinery pushed beyond its intended limits. Fire suppression systems discharged their contents in cascading waves, filling corridors with dense clouds that rendered thermal imaging useless. Emergency lighting failed in sequence, plunging the hunters into darkness that negated their technological advantages. Alarms screamed through speakers that had been silent for 3 years, summoning legitimate security personnel to investigate what appeared to be catastrophic system failure on the supposedly abandoned floor. In the chaos that followed, as footsteps scattered in confusion and professional coordination dissolved into individual survival instincts, I made my way through passages that Dr. Holloway had never intended to serve as escape routes. The hunters who had tracked me with such precision found themselves trapped in the same maze they had used to corner their prey, their knowledge of Ward 7's modifications proving inadequate when the environment itself became their enemy. By the time hospital security reached the 7th floor, drawn by alarms that could not be ignored or explained away, the hunting party had vanished as completely as they had appeared. Emergency teams found only evidence of massive infrastructure failure, damaged systems that would require months of investigation to understand fully. The hidden observation network remained concealed behind walls that showed no obvious signs of modification, its secrets protected by Dr. Holloway's paranoid engineering. I emerged from St. Bartholomew General Hospital as dawn broke over a city unaware of what transpired in its medical institutions after midnight. The documents I carried provided evidence of research that continued to violate every principle of human dignity, but evidence that would require careful presentation to authorities who might find the truth too disturbing to acknowledge. The hunting had ended, but the hunters remained free to select new subjects for future expeditions into darkness that masqueraded as healing. As Ward 7 was sealed again within days, its emergency systems repaired and its access points secured with measures that exceeded the original restrictions. Official reports attributed the incident to deteriorating infrastructure and recommended permanent decommissioning of the entire floor. No mention was made of the 6 vehicles that had been present in the parking lot during the night's events, or of the individuals who had abandoned them when their carefully planned evening devolved into survival scenarios they had not anticipated. The invitation that had drawn me into those corridors was never explained, its origins remaining as mysterious as the organization that had selected me for their research. But I understood now that some hunts continue long after their immediate conclusion, that predators driven by scientific curiosity rather than simple bloodlust possess patience that spans years rather than hours. Subject 7 had escaped, but the research program that had created that designation continued elsewhere in facilities where the next subjects would face hunters who had learned from the failures at St. Bartholomew General. The fluorescent lights still flicker in hospital corridors across the city, casting shadows that hide activities the public prefers not to acknowledge. In the darkness between shifts, when legitimate medical personnel focus on their duties and security guards follow predictable routes, other activities continue in spaces that officially do not exist. The hunting never truly ends. It simply moves to new locations where the screams cannot be heard. And